My name is Laurel Heenan, and I am delighted to be the moderator for this webinar. Our presenters today are Brian Solis and Dr. Mik Kersten. Brian Solis is Global Innovation Evangelist at Salesforce and a leading digital analyst, anthropologist, and 8 times best-selling author. As principal analyst, Brian studies disruptive technologies and its impact on business and markets. In his advisory practice, he humanizes disruptive trends to help technology vendors and business leaders understand how markets and people are evolving and how you can drive innovation and growth. Brian believes the future is ours to define and will share his insights into how companies can become digital first to thrive in the novel economy today. Dr. Mik Kersten is the best-selling author of Project to Product, How to Survive and Thrive in the Age of Digital Disruption with the Flow Framework. Mik started his career as a research scientist at Xerox PARC, where he built the first aspect-oriented development environment. He then pioneered the integration of development environments with Agile and DevOps tools using his computer science PhD at the University of British Columbia. Founding Tasktop out of that research, Mik has written over 1 million lines of open source code that are still in use today and has brought 7 successful open source and commercial products to market. Mik's experiences working with some of the largest digital transformations in the world has led him to identify the critical gap between business leaders and technologists, resulting in his creation of the Flow Framework to connect strategy to delivery. And with that, I will pass the baton to Brian to get us started today.
And Brian, I just want to say it's great to have you on here. I'm a big fan of your work, and I think that the approach that you take. So at Xerox PARC, that, as Laura mentioned, we actually had an anthropology lab. In addition, I was in the computer science lab, but I was always torn between the two because I actually did before my computer science degree, I did an honors thesis in anthropology. So I think connecting these two worlds and then your unique approach, both sort of at the individual and at the market and economy level is just fascinating. So let's just dig straight into that.
Oh man, wow. You sure know how to make somebody's day. I appreciate that. I look forward to spending time with you when we get out, when we're allowed back out and can sit there and talk live, because your work has been really fascinating. And I have to tell you that putting together, even though this is a short presentation, looking at your work, reading your book, it puts so much pressure on me that what should have taken maybe only an hour or so to put together a presentation took hours, because I wanted to make sure that it delivered the best impact possible. So you set the bar very high, and to that, everybody, thank you so much for being with us today. And if you're listening to this on demand later, thank you very much for taking time. This is a real important moment in our work, and it's an opportunity to rethink or to think differently about how we work moving forward, and also why and what that purpose is, because we've been doing a lot of things right up until now, have not been doing a lot of things right. And I believe that this is a moment where we can reassess, rethink, more importantly, retool in how we work, and to what extent and for whom, so that we actually create forward, that we innovate forward, and we don't just iterate in the ways that we had done in the past. So with that said, I'm going to, nothing says innovation like PowerPoint slides, so I've whipped up a few for everybody here. We tend to talk about these times now as the new normal. And I don't know that I can personally, emotionally, or intellectually relate to that. What does the new normal mean? Certainly means that we're not, I think, going back to the way things were, but I have to tell you that there are a lot of people that I have observed in my research making decisions as if we are going back to the way things were. And that isn't the case. What we're witnessing right now, among many things, is the digital disruption of digital transformation itself. I think on day 0 of this pandemic, once things started to shut down, we started to see in our own, and of course in our peers, the faults in digital transformation of 10+ years of investments almost overnight, that our priorities weren't essentially where they needed to be. The how we operationalize digitization wasn't as optimized as it could be. The internal applications and the external applications that we were prioritizing weren't in alignment with where things were going. And so essentially, we're transforming at, or need to transform at, a faster clip in 90 days than we've had to do in 10 years. So digital transformation itself is having its Control Alt Delete moment. And more importantly, we should think about that Control Alt Delete functionality for ourselves, for our perspective, for our mindsets, and for our sense of purpose and how we're moving forward and why. Because going back to normal, it's only going to actually take us back to where a lot of these problems that we're going to talk about today are rooted in: process, definitions of success, what we place at the center of our work to drive it. I actually, as an optimist, I want to see these times beyond just a disruption. I want to see these times beyond what a new normal can be. I want to actually be an architect of what that is. And in order to be an architect of that future, we have to work toward it differently. Right? So what if we choose to see these times not as disruption to our plans or our expectations, but instead as an opportunity to reset, to unlearn, to learn? What if we see our current situation not as disruptive to our previous trajectory, but as an invitation to grow in new directions? Because that's the difference between iteration and innovation. So I think that there's a lot of things in 2020 that can be canceled. A lot of really amazing things, and one day we'll get back to some of these amazing things. For me, concerts are among those. I was so excited to see Rage Against the Machine at Coachella this year, and I hope to have that opportunity at some point in the future. I see a lot of really clever, really sad t-shirts about everything about 2020. But what we're not really taking the time to look at is the fact that hope in 2020 has not been canceled, or imagination in 2020 has not been canceled. That this is a moment for us to sit back in our shelter in place and think beyond the Zoom or Hangouts that we have to get through every single day. In between those moments, what are we going to do differently? How are we going to let this moment touch us differently? How are we going to be inspired differently at the deepest level to see people and opportunities for what they are and what they're becoming? Because I don't know about you, but I will never see a roll of toilet paper the same way I used to again. It's now a precious commodity, and that's actually the psychological result of a somatic marker that has been bookmarked in all of our lives in this pandemic. And why this is important is because as a somatic marker, it's going to always have a deep, visceral, emotional response to the memory that we have of these times. Even though we're chomping at the bit to get back outside and to celebrate with friends, to get and receive hugs, all of those things, this is a defining moment. And it is changing from here on out everything. So the foundations of business will be built upon the pillars of how humanity is changed in various contexts, as a customer, as an employee, you name it. In my work as a digital anthropologist over the years, I have, of course, placed people at the center of everything, going back to the days of smartphones and social media as they were becoming very disruptive. I called that generation Generation C, where the C stood for connected, and it was a name given to a psychographic set of behaviors, not demographics like millennials, centennials, et cetera. And what I had observed then in my early research was that as you went through the customer journey, for example, you made decisions. If you use a smartphone or social media on a daily basis, you use similar apps on a daily basis, you made decisions as a 25-year-old, 45-year-old, 55-year-old similarly. And why that's important is because once you understand the people behind those decisions, you can then work on how to deliver experiences that are going to be relevant and that are going to matter to them. So now, in just a few short months, my research has been hyper focused on how we've changed as a result of these somatic markers, but also because of the behavior shifts that have happened overnight. So, for example, being in shelter in place, for some of us, 2-3 months, it takes on average 66 days for a behavior to change to the point where it's automatic or second nature, right? We've already started to see how people are buying differently, what they're buying differently. Of course, it's all digital first. The same thing is true for work. We were all suddenly remote overnight, and that is changing how we work. We are suddenly meeting more in things like Zooms and Hangouts, which change the actual emotional and intellectual behavior of a meeting, because you have to be fully intent and focused on that video screen, which takes a different skill set and also different biology in order to be present for that. So now I call it, instead of Generation C, we are giving birth to Generation N, where the N stands for novel. And novel means new and unusual. So this new generation of employee and customer gives, or should give, your digital transformation hyper focus. And that means that we have to apply, in addition to what Dr. Mik is going to talk to us about, and the flow framework, is a human-centered approach to that work, where we're placing Generation N in the context of our work, not just to improve operations or efficiencies, how we approach the value stream, but also the why, and how that ROI from that value stream doesn't just deliver against business outcomes, but they deliver against business outcomes because of the human outcomes that stem as a result. And it's important to understand, as we move forward, how we not get caught up in the patterns of before, where we were constantly using new technologies or under the flag of digital transformation to iterate. In thinking we were actually innovating. Iteration is just doing the same things better, and we need it. It's important, but it's not to be confused with innovation, which is investing in new technologies and new processes and new systems to unlock or create or deliver new value. Because the combination of these two things, and what becomes so important moving forward, is that we, instead of being disrupted, become the disruptors. The combination between iteration and innovation is doing the new things that make the old things obsolete. And that leads us to what I believe is not the new normal. It's the novel economy, a new and unusual economy for which there is no playbook, no series of experts to guide us through what it's like to operate digitally in a global pandemic. This is a first for pretty much everybody. And that novel economy breaks out into these three phases that I want us to think about moving forward, which is, right now, we got to survive. It's a reaction to the crisis. It's all about business continuity. It's about setting up remote working. It's about it's making sure that e-commerce doesn't collapse. It's looking at all of the infrastructure to ensure efficiency in operations. It's DevOps. It's a whole bunch of things to keep us in business continuity mode. But at some point, we're going to have to come alive in a way that essentially says, I get that this is a new normal. I get that this is business as usual. So I can either just try to go as is and continue business, or I can look for mastering the new normal and making investments in digital transformation that free us up into starting to explore new opportunities for digitization from an operational standpoint, and then also digital business model innovation, which takes us to the third part, which is about 24 months out, maybe 36. Thrive, being innovative in this novel economy. It's not the path that I think any of us chose, but as a Stoic philosopher might believe, or just the Stoic philosophy, it's like we can't control the events that happen to us, but we can definitely control how we react or respond to them. So digital transformation now, I was joking with Dr. Mik early on about, I originally called it the bimodal digital transformation. I still might, but the idea is that it's duplexed. It's the duplexity of digital transformations, that we have to think about it in two separate but parallel tracks. Digitization, right? So how do we ensure operational excellence in the alive and thrive phases of the novel economy? And then also, how do we create business model innovation? How do we become a successful digital business? How do we create new digital centered products and services for Generation N to align with their expectations and their preferences as they continue to evolve? That's the humanization of all of this. It's placing Generation N, the human being, at the center of this work. As I was writing this slide, I come to learn that Peter Drucker actually did not say this, and that there's a whole debate behind even this statement alone. But I want to let you know that I stand on the side of measuring greatness. It doesn't say that we have to put measures on everything. It just measures that if you want to be great, we can't just say we have to be great. We have to document what that roadmap looks like. We want to be innovative. We have to document that those measures on our way towards that. It's what ensures how we're going to drive towards business outcomes and better experiences for everybody. But Stephen Covey did say this, which is begin with the end in mind. What are those business outcomes? What is it that we want to trigger in ways that don't just benefit our organization, but benefit every stakeholder internally and externally? Because then what you find out is that value streams get an entirely new set of purpose. It isn't just the activities that we're performing to deliver value. It's the value creation itself that becomes so valuable. So then what we're measuring is work to this innovation, this combination of iteration and innovation towards potential disruption. Essentially, it humanizes and gives new value to digitization and digital transformation itself, which, thank goodness, because as a digital anthropologist and just as a human being, it's about time that we start to humanize all of our digital investments moving forward, to rethink, to reinvent, to reimagine what's possible, to master the art of the possible, to find purpose, to be the truth for our markets, for our stakeholders, and to do what's right moving forward. So in order to do this, it isn't just about the tactics of building. It isn't just the tactics of trying to thrive in digital disruption or just disruption itself. It's about working differently as human beings as well. So innovation, as my friends at Gaping Void say, is actually just a code word for new leadership. And that means that in order to be a leader, we have to think not only about those we work with, but also in how we work and what we aspire to accomplish and who we need to be in order to accomplish those things individually and collectively. And so I'll leave you with this. The humanity, placing the human at the center of digital transformation and innovation, is going to take a few things. One, it's going to make us more empathetic, thoughtful, creative, experimental, bold, agile, swift, course digital, but above all else, be human. So with that, thank you for indulging me with some slides, and I look forward to speaking with Dr. Mik.
Excellent, thank you, Brian. So yeah, there are many things I want to kind of dive in terms of what you just shared. I'll give you sort of my perspective of some of it, and then let's dig into some of the more salient points. So you know, I like you, I was thinking, and you've talked a lot about how, you know, we need these new ways, and that the ways of the old period won't work for the new, and that this is something truly novel. That old ways, you know, for me, the really interesting thing is I was digging into what was going on. I was seeing, and from this kind of anthropological perspective, I was asking myself, you know, why are leaders stuck in these old ways of managing? And what I came across is this 2002 book of Dr. Claudia Perez, who analyzed the last 5 technological revolutions. And she noticed that with each came new ways of thinking and new ways of working, but each was interestingly triggered by new means of production. So if we look over, actually, I'll go back to the slide in a moment, but just to frame some of how I've been interpreting what's been going on, we look at these 5 revolutions, from the Industrial Revolution, age of steam and railways, right to now, the age of software and digital. she breaks up each of those revolutions into this installation period where there's this frenzy and this learning, the new ways of working and the new ways of thinking, and eventually actually the new ways of managing. Then there's this turning point that gets triggered by often world events, economic events, and so on. And then there's this installation period. So if we look at what's happening today, we've actually gone from this age of installation where the tech giants, starting with early with Intel and Microsoft, and leading to what we've got right now, they actually very early started looking at the new ways of working, how they can more quickly adapt and learn and look at this duality of how you actually build a digital business. And what's so interesting is that with each of these waves, you actually have this frenzy of capital, at first in Silicon Valley, then elsewhere, that's just funding these new ways of working and thinking, and adapting to the new way that people produce goods and communicate in the new world and so on. And the amazing thing about Perez's work is that she indicates this has happened before. So it's not only this time. Back here in the early 1900s, we had over 300 car startups in Detroit, right? As the age of oil and mass production was happening, as electricity got centralized in a plant, and all of a sudden you could really scale production. And then of course Ford realized that, well, if you're going to scale production, you can't do what was done in the age of steel and heavy engineering and treat people like cogs in the machine building the Hoover Dam, right? Because if those people it's fairly complicated work that they're doing on an assembly line. If you don't train them, you don't invest in them, in his mind, if you don't actually enable them to buy cars, and he started paying people, quite a bit more money than any of his competitors, then you could actually, you don't get the right kind of work being done. And so I think what's happening right now, and it's actually, I spent a lot of time with Dr. Perez on this, what's happening is that we're now in this COVID-19 trigger turning point. We're actually in the age of software and digital. And so I think a lot of what you've been saying right now, some companies already get it, right? We've got these companies who've been very effectively managing software delivery and innovation at scale. They're the FANGs, they're the tech giants, these 9 companies who pre-COVID were the equivalent of the 3rd largest economy. That's the economy the size of Japan. And now the question is, how do we apply what you're saying to bring along the rest of the economy, to bring along all these other companies where if they don't innovate now, if they don't get faster at this, and it's not enough time to talk about innovation, they actually have to put into practice. They have to adapt to this novel economy. So if they don't do it more quickly than they have been, then they won't make it, right? They will be too slow, whether it's a new set of startups that disrupts them faster than before, or it is one of the tech giants that does it. There's now an existential moment for a lot of these organizations. But then the really interesting thing with the work of Dr. Perez that she points out is that after those new ways of thinking, working, managing are mastered, after these companies adapt, you get into this, and this is good for us optimists, Brian, like as you self-identify, as do I, you get into this golden age, into this period of wealth generation. And that's exactly what we saw before as well. If we look back here at the age of oil and mass production, we had this post-war golden age, right? It was triggered by the Great Depression, and it tends to be these economic events that cause these massive shifts where the companies who didn't adapt in the time they had over the last 4 or 5 decades, since the age of software and digital began, all of a sudden they fall so far behind. But then the companies that do make it through this, they adapt and they actually create a more broad and more diverse economy. And they do that by adapting to these new ways of working, and these new ways of thinking, and these new ways of innovating. So I think sort of the world problem that we have right now is how can we help companies think the right way from a leadership, from a staff, from a team point of view. And the thing that obviously I've realized as one of the problems is that old ways of approaching leadership and management just don't work. It's exactly what you're saying, don't work for innovation and digital, right? So if we look at each of the 5 revolutions, each of them, this is all straight from Perez's book, by the way, each of them brought with it a new way of managing delivery, a new way of managing production. There's factory systems, subcontracting, Taylorism. Taylorism is great for building bridges and dams and even the Burj Khalifa. You can optimize resources by treating people like cogs in the machine. Again, Ford realized not so great for more complex tasks. And now in the age of digital, it is, like you said, all about humans and creative tasks, because building software, building digital experiences is fundamentally a creative and conversational endeavor. So if an organization doesn't enable and support that, as many aren't, they're going to fall behind. And of course, the thing that we've noticed is project management actually assumes that you can treat people as sort of these fungible resources, rather than enabling creativity by providing autonomy for teams working within value streams, providing them the right kind of structure, bringing work to people rather than bringing people to work, and so on. So I think I want to make sure we get into some of the key themes that you're talking about. But in the end, from our point of view, it's how do we? There's actually one more thing I just want to mention, because you made me think a lot about this. So I just thought while you were speaking, I threw this onto a couple slides together. But where I think there's this assumption in the old ways of thinking, because it worked for manufacturing, because it worked for building bridges and dams and data centers, is that innovation was basically this more waterfall process, where you do a bunch of design thinking up front, a bunch of collaboration, get together in the same room of building, and then you go build the thing and mass produce it and win the market, right? And we know from your work, from others, that innovation in digital is just not like that. It's ongoing. It's an adaptation for the whole organization to experiment and to learn and to adjust and to pivot. And now, of course, your ability to do that, to create this flow and feedback loop, the faster your flow and feedback loop is, the faster you innovate to a market that's now changing, in a way that nobody can quite predict, right? How deep the downturn will be, how quick the recovery, when these things will happen, and so on. So, of course, we've got tech companies who've already adjusted to this very fast pace of innovation. But my big concern for leadership out there, especially leadership of existing enterprise organizations, is that they haven't. That they don't know how to quickly measure the outcome of innovation. Some of those metrics that you showed, they don't have a fast enough feedback loop. They don't know whether, when they put basically resources and spend into this part of their portfolio, are they getting a result out, or are they building on legacy technologies that are just a technological dead end? So one thing I just want to throw out there before we go into the discussion is that I think there's this big mistake, and this is a framework I don't always introduce in customer conversations, but I use it personally a lot. It's the Cynefin framework from Dave Snowden, and I think there's basically it's actually a very simple model of how to think about problems and innovation. So you've got obvious problems, where you've got tight constraints, right? Like this is assembling a bicycle or a car. You can have a manual for it. You've got complicated problems, right? Like when you're building a bridge, well, that's a complicated problem, because you might realize that the bedrock's not as low as we're in the ground exactly where you thought it was, so you adjust a little bit. But really, you can make a 2-year project plan for any complicated problem. And where we are today is this domain of complexity and chaos. So complexity is you need to learn, you need to adapt, you need to measure, you need to experiment, you need to innovate. And what I'm seeing is that project management is great for complicated problems. It allows you to maximize resources, optimize resources over 2-3-year time horizons. That doesn't really appear in what you've been saying, right? You're talking about innovating, adapting, learning, and pivoting, and so on. And so we're in this domain of complexity. And what I'm seeing is the old ways of leading are applying things that are complicated but generally predictable to the world that's there today, which is innovating fast and digital with a changing market, a changing economic situation, and people's habits and behaviors changing in often unpredictable ways. So I think the key thing is that we need to help these organizations look at their innovations, I've realized, as a portfolio, right? A single startup is a chaotic entity. So it has to basically run in the same direction. It'll hit a brick wall. If the brick wall's too big, it'll die. If it's small enough, it'll pivot. Or if it ran in the right direction, it'll innovate and it'll make something really great and new. So what venture capitalists do is they take that chaos of startups, they make a portfolio out of it, and so that they'll get out of that, they turn to a complex problem. You can manage a portfolio of startups, right? And we have to help these organizations manage their products, their value streams, and innovations as a portfolio. Simplify those, figure out which parts of the digital strategy work, which parts don't, invest there, and then double down and learn and innovate very quickly, which is why we've been so obsessed at Tasktop at providing these portfolio views of here are your product value streams. Forget your projects, forget the activities, forget the proxy metrics. Look at where are you delivering value, how many active users do you have there, what's your rate of flow? Do you need to invest in improving your architecture, moving to cloud more quickly, and leveraging existing applications and so on. So basically look at your flow so that you create this innovation portfolio, because basically thinking your way through the current economy and 12-month plans or 24-month plans just won't work. So I'll pause there, but basically, I think it'd be great if we could dig into some of these topics and your views on this. So
I actually didn't want you to stop that way. So I have taken notes all over the place because this is a conversation of which it's just fascinating, especially that last slide that you're showing. I mean, I had the opportunity to see a lot of that in your work, both preparing for this moment and also in your book. But it is fundamentally coming back to a thing that's come up a few times that you said, which was this idea of management and leading to a new era of management in each of those transformations throughout our history. And I'm curious, what you've seen and observed as being some of the more complex challenges to make a shift like that. I can tell you that from my experience, a lot of the times the greatest hurdles to digital transformation and to innovation have been corporate culture.
mhm.
And corporate culture in of itself, if we were to just kind of humanize that term, it's just simply how human beings work together, and why, and how. And so that's essentially what we're talking about, is changing a corporate culture so that it does allow for these types of things, so that, for example, a flow framework is the norm for an organization. So just curious, how you've seen those challenges in companies that you've worked with at Tasktop or before.
Yeah. So, and Brian, I think you said a key thing, right? Is that the and I'd not thought about before till I heard you say it, which is that we're seeing the digital disruption of digital transformation. So the companies that have become fast at these innovating and adoption cycles, say like a Netflix, right? Which, basically the loop that they've created, the learning loop that they've created, between putting content out there, seeing how the content's adopted, measuring the quality of service, feeding that back into their engineering and their business operations, they've created this very fast feedback loop, this fast learning loop, and they measure both basically their ability to invest dollars into technology, that produce then a customer result, and measure using exactly some of those metrics that you showed earlier. And I think that the culture, I see sort of two culture problems to your point. One is this big disconnect between in established businesses, the ones who've not yet gone far enough into their digital transformations, is that they're using management principles that aren't digitally native, that are actually, they're just using financial metrics of revenue and CAGR and so on. They're not using any of the metrics that tell them, well, when you invest dollars into R&D, you get this result out. And so I realized that was one of the biggest bottlenecks. And it actually is a cultural thing, where you've got financial metrics that don't mean much to the technologist. You've got technology metrics like things like story points and number of commits or so on that don't mean much to the business side. And so the goal of the flow framework was to provide them with a common language so they could have a common conversation. And they could say, okay, well, if we invest in making this data pipeline platform or this machine learning platform, we'll get Y business result, but that will mean that we have to pull back on some of the features you asked for the past few months. That will actually get us towards where the platform that we need for innovation. So I think the biggest thing I saw was this in the cultural problem, because people will they'll bring other aspects of culture, like the frozen middle, where the transformation happens and people are just waiting for the new CIO to come in 18 months later because that's what they've seen the last 3 goes round, and so on. So there are all of those problems, but I think those are almost symptoms of what's going on, which is just a different language and a way of measuring success. To your point about the Drucker or Deming quote, it's really, I also had trouble figuring out who that was a tribute to when I was looking for it, but a different way of measuring success and value. Right? And if you can't get people on the same page of measuring success and value, it's very hard to merge those two cultures. So my goal with the flow framework was to actually create a simple measurement of productivity and flow in software value streams. And actually, because it's a creative discipline, to add the notion of employee happiness to that, because one of the main flow metrics is, one of the metrics in the flow framework is actually happiness. Not just, people measure customer happiness through customer net promoter score, but it's actually measuring employee happiness through employee net promoter score on each value stream. Because if you're overloading this set of people who are not understanding their personal situation, you're actually getting a lot less productivity out because your staff is unhappy. And I think this is what I realized, is that people want some kind of simple metric, like we put in X dollars, Y revenue goes out. But what we're talking about, these digital systems, is actually complexity. You need to be able to measure this dynamic system that people are a part of. Their happiness is a part of the system. If their happiness goes down, well, guess what? There's an implication of that. So, and the implication is an implication to your business. So the whole point being, and to your point of making human, it's interesting. Even though I obsess about measurement with my kind of background on the science side, I've realized that actually measuring and delivering happiness is such a key part of this dynamic system of innovation, that I elevated it, right to the top level. And I think it's been absolutely critical. You do the wrong things on pushing people too hard in the wrong ways, happiness goes down, you get a lot less out. And the finance CFOs understand that. It's fascinating. So.
And to your point, I mean, we live in a time where the CFO has quickly risen to be the decision maker in a lot of new technologies that are implemented right now, because costs are absolutely important. I admire your emphasis on happiness, and I wish more organizations did, internally and externally. I remember I did some work several years ago, back in the day when Zappos was sort of the poster child for
Yep.
great customer service. And I don't know if many people realize this, but Zappos has a program, essentially like a university, that's similar to Disney's university, where you can come in at Disney, for example. You could learn how to create Disney magic within your own organization or within your customer experience. And Zappos has a similar program too, where you can create happiness for customers and for employees. And one of the things that I realized that Zappos did very well was that coming back to your point, to sort of defining success and value, was that happiness was actually part of that metric, and to the point where, to get to customer happiness and customer satisfaction, they had to empower employees to feel like they could try new things, to test and learn, to fail, but that they were empowered to deliver against that customer happiness. And in that, they would actually increase employee happiness as well. It was almost, I mean, it's common sense, but it's also counterintuitive in many ways. Simply because the points that you've raised is that because we're so tied to these legacy management infrastructures and frameworks, that we don't even realize that psychologically, even though we want to do new things or try new things, that we can't even break those ties until we either finally break them or they're broken for us. So I want to ask you a question, because when you brought up Netflix, one of the things that I realized in that feedback loop that you were mentioning wasn't just technological, it also was creative. That feedback loop didn't just feed the operations, it actually fed their content creation, what new shows, what new movies that they would create, how those performed, how that would fund whatever was next. And that feedback loop led to innovation in essentially product. And it continues to do so, and especially in a hyper-competitive market now, where they have competitors that they didn't have when they first started. And I made a note that to me, it sort of breaks down into a couple of things, and I'd love to hear how you would approach what people put into the value stream, so that then we define our framework moving forward in this novel economy. So with that, you have to adapt, right? So there's management towards adaptation, and that's continuous, right? And then there's also a framework and management metrics and systems for creativity or for innovation. And so how should a company think about balancing those?
Yeah, so I think we need, I think this is a key thing, right? For those who've read Tony Hsieh's book, Delivering Happiness, that, that absolutely inspired me, early on in my career as a CEO, how important that was. And I think we need to understand that, so I think the book did a really interesting job in just his whole approach of customer happiness and staff happiness and how they're intertwined. So what I realized that there's such a focus, there's already an understanding in the business side of how important understanding the customer, understanding adoption, understanding retention rates, understanding for Netflix to understand, for their recommendation engine or just their content strategy, what's being used and what's being consumed. And I realized in these same organizations, especially the larger ones on the business side, people understood customer happiness, but failed to understand the happiness of developers because they were approaching, or their other IT practitioners, because they were approaching that as a production process, right? They were actually approaching it as an assembly line, and it's not. Creating digital experiences and innovating is a creative process. And people who are not engaged and who are not happy can't be creative in the same ways. They can't have the same kind of creative discussions and engagement. So I realized, and different things can cause that, right? It can be command and control leadership. It can be the wrong kind of incentive structures. All sorts of things can affect that. And so I realized that, but basically helping organizations, first of all, create these product value streams, which is these product value streams are just really just units with which you can manage innovation. And there's, I think, a question that come in. We'll get to more of the questions shortly, but how do you create product value streams? Well, you define them based on how you want to innovate. So in the example of, an organization like a Salesforce, it becomes very obvious, right? There's Sales Cloud, there's Service Cloud, and so on. Those have basically different stakeholders, and they have different innovation strategies. They'll leverage common platforms for innovation, and so on. So the product value streams are clear. But for a lot of organizations that have come at software from a project management point of view, they haven't actually defined who the customers are, what the value streams are, or who the teams are. So those things are completely misaligned. And so you see from a tech giant this basically perfect alignment of customers pulling value to the organization structure. It's basically its org chart, its technology stack, supporting that org chart. And basically from that, this feedback loop of knowing, okay, we're seeing a ton of adoption through, this whole trend of how important customer success has become of a Service Cloud or something of that sort, right? So then you pour more into that, and then you get this virtuous feedback loop. Now, the Netflix example is a bit different because it's one planet-scale product, right? It gets more interesting for organizations that have multiple products, multiple lines of business, and so on. So like a Salesforce, a Microsoft, and Amazon. And those companies have all nailed it. And so, the key thing is we need to define what those product value streams are. Otherwise, we don't know what to innovate around. We don't know what's working, what's not. And then what we've been doing in practice is actually say, okay, well, stop measuring things like employee net promoter score for all your developers, all your testers, all your support staff. Measure it across those product value streams, because that's where communication disconnects could be. That's where you could have some toxic management. That's where you could have too many people who are become too cynical, or that's where you have a technology problem because you've not given your developers enough time to re-architect something. And so it's really taking, I think we need to innovate around portfolios, again, because without experimentation, the world is just too complex. And that's what tech giants have become, with a few exceptions of these simpler portfolios like in Netflix. That's what tech giants have become so good around. So we need those product value streams. We need to both measure the flow of value, which the flow metrics are, and then we need to measure business results. And the key business result the flow framework says is it's not just cost and value, so you can determine lifecycle productivity. It's also the happiness of the staff building it. And empirically, in measuring our organization's value stream, you will actually see that when you have a decline in the happiness score, you'll get less productivity out. And then that less productivity, of course, drives less revenue. That reduces your competitiveness or your ability to innovate. So again, I think that's why I've tried to make sure we've got a small number of these very meaningful metrics, both for the business side and for the production side itself, for that creative process. And the internal happiness of your staff is has to be one of the top 5. So.
Yeah. So well said. I don't know if we have time for me to ask you another question, or if we need to go to audience questions.
Oh, go ahead, Brian. Yeah.
Okay. Well, one of the things that I hear so often is the reference to the FANGs. I pre-COVID, I I remember I published a report on the state and future of retail innovation, and a lot of it was developed qualitatively through a series of interviews with executives trying to drive innovation within their retail brands. And I remember just how often Amazon came up in every single conversation. And I thought, man, at this point, Amazon is over 20 years old. And we if our aspiration as an organization is to compete against somebody with a 20+ year head start, what what are the questions we're not asking ourselves to inspire not only new management but also new ways of thinking of what we can and should be working on, right? So it's one thing to aspire to become like a digital native organization. It's another thing to think like one. So I guess the question that I want to ask you is, and I'll use this example to get there, is Starbucks, overnight retools its app and its process infrastructure for contactless delivery so that you can order ahead still your favorite coffee and get it as seamlessly and quickly as possible. That took some digital remodeling, some rethinking, very quick, to make sure that it wasn't just responsive, but that the experience was at the Starbucks level that it needed to be at. So you have a company like Starbucks that wasn't inherently digital, but it's thinking digital. So
Yeah.
how does the regular legacy organizations kind of get there?
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's the key thing, right? Because and there's like two parts of your question I think are really important. First of all, it's true. A lot of organizations compare themselves to companies that are now 20 years old, and some of those companies, I do want to say that what some of those companies have done with basically transforming themselves is impressive. Microsoft has transformed itself multiple times, right? They're preventing, they actually I think exemplify to disrupting themselves in order to keep up with the digital age, to your earlier point. So that needs to keep happening to these companies, because if Perez's models, the ones I showed earlier, are predictive, we've now entered the deployment period, and it means there'll be another technological wave. Like, to your point, and that I think this is coming through in sort of multiple year communications, the way that things were done in the last 20, 30 years is not going to be the way things will be done by this new generation of technologies, of innovators. And what Perez says that's so fascinating is we don't know exactly what that will be like yet, right? And that's why the word novel it's truly novel. We can learn, we can adapt, and the organizations that learn more quickly will be the ones that get onto that wave more sooner. So I think there's definitely something to that. I think the challenge is that the lessons that the tech giants have learned over the last 2-3 decades in terms of producing software at scale and innovating at scale, other organizations have not yet adapted to, right? Starbucks, it took Starbucks a while, and there's some interesting stories about Starbucks, the ways that they struggled around digital innovation, of course, then started getting ahead of it. And so I think the main thing is again, to basically create a management model that's not oriented around treating innovation and R&D and software spend as this cost center that's off to the side, but making it a core part of your business operations, knowing at a board and executive leadership team level, as tech giants do, exactly what the whole portfolio is. Knowing whether in these times of COVID, a part of the business that was previously a cash cow is going to decline, so that you need to rebalance those dollars and put them into something that may be a bit more risky, that you need to iterate on more quickly, but where you actually need to be, say, on a cloud platform that will allow you to iterate and learn more quickly, rather than doing things the old way. So I think it's actually elevating that notion of product innovation and measurement, because if you don't measure quickly, you can't wait 12 months right now to decide whether this is going to work or not. You need a faster feedback loop, and that's actually the point of the flow metrics, to give you a faster feedback loop that purely financial metrics would give you. So, so I think that's basically my answer. So I think a bunch of the practices, it's a really interesting question, because I think a bunch of the practices adopted by the tech giants still need to be applied. And then I think, your point's even more fascinating, is that some of these tech giants will actually be disrupted in this next wave of what comes in from the novel economy. So I think let's take some of these questions. We've got one over here from Alexi. It seems that employee engagement and cultural metrics combined with financial metrics are the key to the velocity and adoption to the novel business environment and thriving in this new environment. Is this aligned with your respective points of view? So my answer is yes. Brian, do you have any more? Well-phrased question. So
I have to say something more than yes. So one is, pick up this book and explore opportunities to work with Mik and his team at Tasktop, because that fundamentally, it's a force functioning device. I think that gets you toward the question that you're asking. The other thing is I do want to plug a friend's company, Gaping Void. I did a lot of work with them over the years, and Gaping Void is a culture design company. And they actually did work with Tony Hsieh and Zappos to sort of bring that culture to life. And culture design is something I think you'll be hearing more about, especially in a novel economy, because culture is, up to this point, sort of the byproduct of how we work and to shareholder value and stakeholder value. But what culture design says is, what is it that we're actually trying to do? What's our sense of purpose as an organization, as a single entity? And then how do we create the norms and behaviors of the organization that then move us in that direction in ways that everybody feels like they're part of it? So then once you have that established, you essentially can create the engagement metrics, the employee experience metrics that track how you're moving and feeling toward that path. And this, I think, is where happiness also comes into play. It's something that we have to be much more thoughtful and strategic about. And I know this is a little bit off topic, but I promise it's not off topic, is that I think one of the things coming out of the novel economy, this Control-Alt-Delete moment, and what's inspiring Generation N, without it being so clearly articulated yet, is that among the things that's changing with all of us, especially in shelter in place, and if you look at what people are buying and what people aren't buying, I actually think our values have started to change. And I also think that maybe our definition of status and success are starting to change. And so why that's important is that because as an organization, what goes into your framework, what goes into your value stream, actually now has to start to align with how human beings are defining happiness, success, and what it is they value. That's going to be culturally, and that's also going to be what your brand stands for, and also the products and services you create to reinforce that brand feeling, experience. So I actually think that all of this is a moment to also answer, like, what does your brand stand for? Because I think that's going to affect everything that you do.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think it's, companies need to, now basically make sure that their vision, their brand, their strategy matches this novel economy. And I think, and then again, the interesting part of that is that you need to adapt more quickly because we're still learning what that is, right? So you need to be compatible with the direction, but the path is going to be a learning process. And there's actually a question that came up that's related to this. So Greg asked, culture starts with vision. Do you think the leaders who are struggling with becoming digitally native lack self-awareness? And whether that comes to terms with the need for a new or revised vision. So I'll address that quickly, Brian, but I'd love to get your view on it. But my view is, leadership in terms of the successful companies needs to create, to your point, a culture for innovation, right? So the way that we look at it, the way we suggest organizations look at it is to define your product value streams, know what they are, but if you don't give them some autonomy to innovate and to choose a direction and to learn from the customers and to pivot, you just can't innovate from the top down that way, right? So setting a vision, I think the key thing is that empowering product value streams and then these leaders, and you have to combine business and technology at this point, right? That's what successful technology companies have done, and push down that autonomy and authority to create innovation to those levels rather than expecting that all come from above or from a chief digital officer or from someone of that sort. I think is critical. So I think, to me, the empowerment to do that, to define and provide autonomy to those product value stream is key to how leaders need to adapt. But I'd love to get your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, there's a famous drawing that's on the internet that shows traditional leadership, which I would define more like traditional management, of a leader on top of a platform pointing down to his employees as which direction they're going, and then a leader in line with everyone, pointing to where they're going together, because it's a different philosophy, and with a different philosophy, excuse me, comes a different approach. So I think often when we talk about leadership, we're actually talking about management, and the leadership is something new and much more important, something personal. And it takes reflection, and it takes an incredible self-awareness to understand which one you are. Are you a manager or are you a leader? Because a leader isn't someone who just gets someone to follow them. It's someone who empowers someone else to also lead. And especially in an agile environment, you have to be able to move much quicker, make decisions much faster, to test and learn much faster than we do today. So to that point, there's an opportunity. I have this formula. I say it's ignorance plus arrogance equals irrelevance. And this is where a lot of managers are today. So to be a leader, you have to, and I borrowed this from Gaping Void and Jason Corman, who worked with BJ Fogg at Stanford University, who is one of the leaders of persuasive design, which was this model of articulated, well, a future motivating state. Could you communicate to people right now in a novel economy, what is our new future going to look like beyond just business continuity and reaction? Where are we going? And then articulate the beliefs that are going to help us work together to move towards that future motivating state, because it's beliefs then that become empowering for all of us. They give us sort of our guardrails, give us our zone of decision making, and those beliefs are actually psychologically have been proven to create the norms that then incite the behaviors within the organization to move in that direction. So I think this is a real personal reflection moment for anyone in a leadership position to ask themselves some real important questions. Am I leading by management, or am I leading by how we would truly define leadership?
Yeah, I agree. And then I think it's interesting the degree to which, because I think that question is a question I've heard often, the degree to which some managers in leadership positions are having trouble letting go. And I actually think, let's say taking their point of view and empathizing with them, talking to them, why are you having trouble letting go? I've found this common thread, which is that the reason they want this kind of command and control aspect of project management and cost metrics and so on is it's all they have. They don't know if they're doing the right things for their boards, for their CEO, for their leadership, because again, there's no common way of measuring whether this experiment was right or it was wrong and so on. So I think the way that we can help managers become leaders at these senior levels is again to get a common measurement framework that allows for experimentation, for product innovation, for understanding which parts of your portfolio need to die. Whether it's, and again, not just purely through financial metrics, but because you might have hit a technology dead end that for a technology stack that no longer makes sense in a post-pandemic world. So yeah, I think my view is I think we need to get people there, and I'm hoping that actually taking a common view of measurement that supports innovation and the technology and business side, we actually help catalyze that, because I think there's nothing more important than helping today's leaders make that transition. So
yeah, right on. I'll do an impersonation of an emoji, hands raised.
Excellent. Okay, Brian, I think we are at time. That was excellent. Any last words?
Replay this, because I certainly I have so many notes on things that I'm going to follow this up with writing. So I feel very inspired. Thank you, Mik. Thank you, everybody, for being part of this. This is the foundation for how we move forward, and I wish you the best, and would love to hear from you as you continue to evolve, continue to iterate, and continue to innovate.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Brian. Thanks, everyone.